It began with whispers. In the capital's crowded streets, people spoke in low voices about the king, not with pride, but with fear. They said he no longer listened to his counsel, that he had locked himself in the palace for weeks, emerging only to make strange proclamations. Some claimed they had seen him staring at the sun for hours, convinced it was speaking to him. Others swore he believed he could command the dead. This was not just any king. He was the ruler of one of the wealthiest empires in the region, a land where gold flowed through markets and the palace shone brighter than the temples. But his wealth was matched only by his ego. From the day he ascended the throne, he insisted he was chosen by the heavens, not merely to rule, but to redefine the very meaning of divinity. At first, his strange habits were dismissed as quirks. He would demand golden plates at every meal, even for bread and water. He ordered musicians to play the same song for hours, claiming it kept the spirits calm. But soon, these oddities deepened into something darker. He began summoning priests to the palace at midnight, forcing them to read sacred texts backward. He declared certain gods obsolete and insisted the people worship him instead. The court was powerless to stop him. Many who questioned his actions simply vanished. Advisors who urged him to act in the people's interest were replaced by flatterers willing to nod at every outrageous idea. By the time the king announced his most shocking decree, no one dared to openly challenge him. One morning, the royal herald appeared in the city square with a scroll sealed in red wax. Before the gathered crowd, he read the king's latest command. "The queen of this empire shall be none other than my own blood, for only the divine may unite with the divine. From this day forth, she is to be honored as the living goddess of our land." Goss swept through the crowd. Everyone knew the queen he referred to, his own sister. She was young, beautiful, and widely respected for her charity work, but now she was to be his wife, and, if his words were true, the object of the kingdom's worship. It was not just an act of blasphemy in the eyes of the people's faith. It was the ultimate violation of tradition, morality, and law, yet no one could speak against him. The guards patrolling the streets carried orders to silence dissent before it spread. Behind the palace walls, preparations for the wedding began. Priests were summoned to bless the union, though most came trembling, unsure if they would leave alive. Gold from the royal treasury was poured into building a massive altar in the main square, where the divine marriage would be displayed before the people. The king's mind seemed to spiral deeper into madness. He began referring to himself as the sun and to his sister as the moon. Servants were forced to bow before them both, not as rulers, but as living gods. What no one yet knew was that this marriage would mark the beginning of a reign so cruel, so twisted that it would plunge the empire into fear for generations. The day chosen for the wedding was unlike any other. At dawn, soldiers filled the streets, their armor catching the morning light, but their presence was not for celebration. They were there to control the crowd, to make sure no voice rose in protest. People were ordered to attend, whether they wished to or not. Those who resisted were dragged from their homes and forced into the square. The king spared no expense. The palace gates were draped in gold cloth, and thousands of white flowers were strewn across the ground. A massive platform had been built in the heart of the city, high enough that everyone could see the ceremony. At its center stood a throne made from pure ivory, carved with symbols that blurred the line between religion and royal power. The bride, his sister, was brought out first. She wore a gown that shimmered like liquid silver, her face veiled so heavily that only her eyes could be seen. Those eyes told a different story from the pageantry around her. They were wide, unblinking, and filled with dread. People whispered that she had been kept in the palace for weeks, forbidden from speaking to anyone outside the royal guard. When the king emerged, the crowd fell silent. He wore a crown of gold shaped like the sun, its sharp rays pointing outward like a weapon. His robes were crimson and heavy with jewels, the color chosen, he said, to represent the bloodline of the gods. In one hand, he held a golden scepter. In the other he carried a scroll that contained his own rewritten version of the kingdom's sacred laws. The high priest was summoned to conduct the marriage rites. His hands trembled as he opened the ancient book, but the king stopped him mid-sentence. The king said, his voice loud enough to echo across the square, "Today we speak not the words of old men, but the words of the heavens, as told to me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. In their religion, no one was allowed to alter the sacred marriage blessing. Yet here was the king replacing divine tradition with his own will. The priest dared not refuse. Instead, he repeated the king's words, each line twisting faith into something unrecognizable. At the end of the ceremony, the king lifted his sister's veil. The crowd saw her pale face, her lips pressed tightly together. She did not smile. She did not speak. But the king took her silence as proof of divine purity. Then, before the crowd could react, he ordered everyone to kneel. "You kneel before your gods," he declared, "and you will worship us as you do the sun and the moon." The people obeyed, though not out of devotion. The soldiers standing among them made sure of that. In the days that followed, temples were stripped of their old idols and replaced with statues of the king and queen. Any priest who resisted was arrested. Many vanished. The wedding was not just a ceremony, it was a warning. A declaration that the king was no longer bound by mortal laws, nor by the gods themselves. And as the first month of this divine marriage passed, the king's demands would grow stranger, more dangerous and more impossible to question. From the outside, the queen's new life appeared gilded. She wore crowns worth more than a merchant's fortune and robes, so heavy with jewels that 2 servants had to help her walk. The king made sure her image was carved into coins, painted onto banners, and set in gold within every public building. The empire saw her face everywhere, but few realized how much she had vanished from her own life. Inside the palace, her world was a prison. She was never allowed to leave the royal chambers without a guard. Every conversation she had was monitored. Even her letters to friends and family were read, altered, or destroyed before they reached their destination. To the public, she was a goddess. In reality, she was a captive. The king's obsession grew by the day. He ordered her to sit beside him during every council meeting, even though she was never permitted to speak. Servants were commanded to bow to her as they did to him, but any glance that lingered too long was punished. Some servants were whipped for looking upon the goddess without devotion. Meals became rituals. The king claimed the food had to be blessed by their union before it could be eaten. Each dish was presented to both of them, and only after the king took the first bite could she follow. He told the court this was to protect her purity. But those who worked in the palace knew it was simply another way to control her. Worse still were the midnight ceremonies. At strange hours, the king would wake her and lead her into the Hall of Mirrors, a vast chamber lit only by oil lamps. There, he forced her to stand beside him, while he prayed to his own reflection, declaring that they were the earthly forms of celestial beings. He would make her repeat the words after him, words that denied her humanity, words that made her nothing more than an object in his madness. Some whispered that the queen had tried to resist in the beginning. A guard claimed he had overheard her pleading to be freed from the marriage. But those pleas only pushed the king deeper into paranoia. He surrounded her with hand-picked attendants who reported her every movement and expression. Even the women who dressed her were spies. Outside the palace walls, rumors spread. Merchants spoke of the queen's silent sorrow, and traveling priests claimed they had been turned away from the gates when they asked to see her. The people began to suspect that their goddess was no more divine than they were, only more trapped. Yet no one dared act. The king's punishments for defiance were swift and cruel. For now, the queen remained in her cage, wearing her golden chains. But cracks were already forming in the king's carefully crafted image, and it would not be long before those cracks began to widen. It began with a single proclamation. The king announced that the gods had spoken to him in a dream, demanding offerings worthy of the heavens. The usual temple sacrifices of grain, wine, and incense were no longer enough. Now the offerings had to include blood. At first he claimed it was symbolic, a few drops taken from the royal couple during festivals to bless the people. But within weeks, the practice escalated. The king declared that only the blood of the most devoted subjects could sustain the divine bond between him and the queen. His soldiers were sent into the city to find volunteers. In truth, many of these so-called volunteers were the poor, the powerless, and the politically inconvenient. The rituals took place in the Grand Plaza, the same place where their wedding had been held. A massive stone altar was erected, its surface darkened from repeated use. On certain nights, the square would fill with the sound of drums as prisoners were brought forward, their wrists bound in gold-threaded rope. The king, dressed in white to symbolize purity, would stand above them with a ceremonial blade. He claimed their blood was being given to the gods, but everyone knew it was feeding his own need for power and fear. The queen was forced to attend every one of these ceremonies. Dressed in her finest robes, she would stand beside the king, silent and pale. Her presence was meant to bless the act, but witnesses swore they saw her turn her face away when the blade fell. Some whispered that tears had rolled down her cheeks during the rituals, but no one dared speak of it openly. The people were horrified, but fear kept them silent. Even the priests who once opposed the king now publicly praised him, terrified of meeting the same fate as those on the altar. Trade in the capital began to slow as foreign merchants avoided a city known for its public bloodshed. Still, the king declared the rituals a triumph, claiming the kingdom was closer to the heavens than ever before. Behind closed doors, some members of the court began to plot. The blood rituals were not just cruelty. They were eroding the stability of the empire. Each drop spilled in the plaza was another crack in the foundation of the king's rule. And in those cracks, the seeds of rebellion were quietly taking root. The queen knew nothing of these early whispers of resistance. Her world was still the palace, her days still spent under the constant gaze of the king's watchful eyes. But even within those walls, she could feel a change in the air. The king's madness was no longer contained, and the people's patience, like the kingdom's treasury, was beginning to run dry. It started so small that the king didn't notice. A word left unspoken, a glance that lasted a heartbeat too long. For years the queen had played the part he demanded, silent, obedient, the perfect goddess by his side. But the blood rituals had changed something in her. Standing beside him as lives were taken had forced her to see that if she did nothing, there would be no end to his madness. Her defiance began in the only way she could risk. Through the smallest acts, when the king ordered her to wear the golden crown shaped like the moon, she began leaving it on the table, claiming it was too heavy. When he demanded she recite his self-written prayers, she would pause just slightly before speaking, letting her hesitation hang in the air for all in the court to feel. Her attendants noticed first. These women, chosen by the king to spy on her, had always reported every movement, every word. But slowly, some of them began to turn. Perhaps it was pity, perhaps it was fear of the king's growing cruelty, or perhaps they simply recognized her as their only hope for change. They stopped reporting her smallest rebellions. They started whispering news from outside the palace, stories of merchants closing shops, farmers hiding from tax collectors, and soldiers quietly deserting their posts. One night after a blood ritual, the queen returned to her chambers and found a folded scrap of parchment beneath her pillow. On it were only 5 words, "He cannot rule forever." There was no name, no seal, but it was a dangerous message. She burned it at once, but the words stayed with her. In public, she continued to play her role. She still stood beside the king during ceremonies, still allowed herself to be displayed like a sacred icon. But in private, she began to ask quiet, calculated questions. Questions to the right servants, the right guards, the right members of the court. Who commands the palace gates? How many guards are loyal to my brother, who visits the treasury? Each answer was a thread, and she was slowly weaving them into a map of the king's power. The king remained blind to her growing resolve, too absorbed in his own delusions to see the danger. He was planning a new decree, one that would push the empire even further into chaos. He spoke of a great pilgrimage, where the entire kingdom would be forced to march to the capital to kneel before him and his goddess. The queen listened, her face calm, her hands folded in her lap. But inside, she felt the shift. The line between endurance and rebellion had been crossed. If the king thought she was still his captive goddess, he was wrong. She was becoming something far more dangerous, a goddess with a plan. The great pilgrimage was unlike anything the kingdom had seen before, and that was exactly the king's intention. Messengers were sent to every corner of the empire, carrying his decree. Every man, woman, and child was to leave their homes and travel to the capital. There, they would kneel in the plaza before the sun and moon, bringing offerings of gold, grain, and livestock. Anyone who refused would be branded a traitor to the gods. The journey was brutal. Families were forced to abandon their fields at harvest time. Merchants left their shops unattended, and the roads became choked with endless lines of weary travelers. Many arrived barefoot and starving, carrying what little they could. Some collapsed along the way, never reaching the capital. The king did not care. In his mind, their suffering only proved their devotion. When the first wave of pilgrims entered the city, they were met not with hospitality, but with soldiers who searched them for valuables. Anything of worth was seized for the holy treasury. Those who resisted were beaten, sometimes in front of their families. The gold and goods were paraded into the palace, while the people were herded into the plaza like livestock. The queen was forced to watch as the king stepped onto the balcony above them, his golden crown catching the sun. "Behold your gods," he shouted, "the sun and the moon, together in eternal glory. You live because we will it, you breathe because we bless it." His voice echoed over the silent crowd. Silent not from reverence, but from rage. Then came his final insult. The king ordered that every family must leave behind one gift of blood for the gods before returning home. It was a cruel twist on the blood rituals. Now, every pilgrim had to sacrifice a relative. In practice, it meant that the poorest families, unable to bribe the soldiers, were forced to give up sons, daughters, or elderly parents to be taken to the palace. The king claimed these offerings would ensure the kingdom's prosperity. The truth was far simpler. It was a show of absolute control. The crowd's grief turned to fury. Some began to shout, though the soldiers quickly silenced them with blows from their spears, but the anger could not be beaten away. In the days after, as the pilgrims were released to make their long journeys home, whispers of rebellion spread faster than the king's messengers could contain. The queen, standing beside her brother, saw it in their eyes as they looked up at her. The unspoken plea for justice. For the first time, she felt something like hope. The people were no longer afraid in the way they once were. They had seen the king's cruelty laid bare, and they would not forget. The king mistook their silence for submission. The queen recognized it for what it truly was: the calm before the storm. The great pilgrimage had left the empire drained, of food, of wealth, and of patience. The moment the pilgrims returned home, the whisper networks began. Farmers spoke in low voices over dying crops. Blacksmiths passed messages under the clang of hammers. Even some of the king's own soldiers, disgusted by the blood rituals, began to trade information with known dissidents. The rebellion didn't begin with swords. It began with secrecy. A merchant in the northern provinces started hiding fugitives wanted by the king's guard. A village priest refused to replace the old god statues, keeping them hidden beneath the temple floor. And in the capital itself, an unlikely alliance was forming. Palace servants dismissed guards, and a few high-ranking nobles who had lost their influence to the king's flatterers. The queen heard of them before they ever approached her. A seamstress who mended her gowns let slip a coded phrase while pinning a hymn. "The moon does not rise without the sun, but the sun cannot rise without the sky." It was a test. The queen answered with a phrase she remembered from her childhood, one their mother had often said, "Even the sun sets." That night, the seamstress smuggled her a sealed note. The message inside was simple: "We are ready. Say the word." It was the first time in years the queen felt she might not be alone. But she knew the danger. The king's paranoia was growing, and his spies were everywhere. He even suspected she was involved in plotting against him. Her life and the lives of everyone connected to her would be over. Still, the rebellion needed her, not for her divine image, but for what she truly was: a symbol the people could rally behind. She began meeting secretly with the conspirators during the king's late-night prayer sessions. When he locked himself in the Hall of Mirrors to worship his reflection, she slipped away to a hidden passage that led to the servants' quarters. They spoke in hushed tones, drawing maps of the palace and marking the locations of the king's most loyal guards. The plan was dangerous. They would strike during the next blood ritual, when the king would be exposed in the plaza, and most of the soldiers would be occupied with controlling the crowd. The queen's role was to distract him, to keep his attention on her long enough for the rebels to move in. The risk was immense. If they failed, the king's revenge would be catastrophic. But if they succeeded, the empire could finally break free from his madness. The queen returned to her chambers that night, with her heart pounding. She stared at the golden crown on her table, the one shaped like the moon. For years it had been a symbol of her captivity. Soon, It might become something else entirely, the signal that the people's rebellion had begun. The day of the ritual was set. The sun and the moon would rise together one last time. The morning of the ritual dawned hot and heavy, the air thick with the scent of smoke from hundreds of torches lining the plaza. People gathered not with reverence but with a grim, silent anticipation. The king, as always, made his entrance with spectacle, his crimson robes dragging across the platform, his golden crown flashing like fire in the sun. Beside him, the queen walked slowly, her silver gown glinting under the watchful eyes of soldiers. The altar was ready. Prisoners knelt before it, their heads bowed, awaiting the king's holy blessing. Drums beat in steady rhythm, each strike echoing through the tense crowd. The queen's heart pounded with them, her eyes scanning for the signal. Somewhere among the crowd, rebels were hidden. Farmers, merchants, even a few of the king's former guards, waiting for her moment. The king raised his blade to begin the ritual. On this day he boomed, "The sun and the moon will drink the lifeblood of devotion." "And the gods will." The queen stepped forward, interrupting him. Her voice rang out clear and sharp. "On this day, the sun will set." The words rippled through the crowd like a spark across dry grass. Heads turned. King froze, his expression twisting from confusion to rage. "What did you say?" he demanded. Before he could react further, the first arrow flew. It struck one of his guards squarely in the chest, then another. Chaos erupted. Rebels surged from the crowd, weapons drawn, cutting through the stunned soldiers. The drums stopped, replaced by the clash of steel and the shouts of men and women who had been waiting years for this moment. The queen moved quickly, grabbing the ceremonial blade from the king's hands. She did not strike him, not yet. Instead, she held it high, letting the crowd see who now wielded it. "For the people," she shouted. The roar that answered her was deafening. The king tried to retreat toward the palace, but his path was blocked. Rebels were everywhere now, pouring in from the alleys and side streets, overwhelming his loyalists. His voice, once able to silence thousands, was swallowed by the chaos. The queen's attendants, the ones who had smuggled her messages and hidden her defiance, surrounded her, shielding her from the fighting. They urged her toward safety, but she shook her head. "Not until it ends," she said. The battle in the plaza raged for what felt like hours, though it was only minutes. One by one, the king's defenders fell. Blood ran down the altar steps, but for the first time in years, it was not the blood of the innocent. When the fighting stopped, the king was on his knees, stripped of his crown. The plaza that had once been the stage for his power was now the place of his undoing. The people stood watching, breathing hard, their fate hanging on what came next. The queen stepped forward. The sun and moon stood together one last time, but now one of them was about to vanish forever. The king knelt in the blood-stained plaza, his golden crown lying bent and broken at his feet. His robes, once immaculate, were torn and spattered with the same blood he had demanded for years. Around him, the people stood in a wide circle, silent but unyielding. Every face was turned toward the queen. She moved slowly, her silver gown trailing through the dirt, the ceremonial blade still in her hand. For years, she had been forced to stand beside him, a silent ornament to his cruelty. Now every step toward him felt like reclaiming those stolen years. The king looked up, his eyes wild. "Sister," he hissed, his voice trembling between rage and desperation. "You are nothing without me. You are the moon. I am the sun. Without me, you will fade into darkness." The queen stopped in front of him, her shadow falling across his bowed form. "The sun sets," she said softly, so only he could hear, "and the world still turns." Some in the crowd expected her to strike him down then and there. Instead, she turned to the people. "This man has called himself a god," she said, her voice carrying across the plaza. "But he has taken more than any god would dare.
I have stolen your sons and daughters.
Your gold and grain, your faith and your freedom. Today, the sun sets, not by the hand of the moon, but by the will of the people." A murmur rose into a roar. The rebels stepped forward, seizing the king by the arms. He thrashed and shouted, his once commanding voice now a pitiful broken thing. The queen did not watch as they dragged him away toward the palace dungeons. For her, it was already over. In the days that followed, the blood-soaked altar was dismantled, its stones scattered into the river. Statues of the sun and moon were torn down, replaced with the old gods. The king's name was erased from official records, as though he had never existed. Some said he spent his final days in a locked cell, speaking to the walls as if they were his celestial audience. The queen refused to take the throne. She returned to a quiet life, free from crowns and ceremonies. But to the people, she remained a symbol. Not a goddess, but something far greater. She was proof that even the most untouchable tyrant could fall. And so, the story of the Mad King ended not in divine glory, but in the shadows of his own prison. The empire healed, slowly, and the people learned to speak openly again. They would remember the blood. They would remember the fear. But above all, they would remember the day the sun finally set.